June 18, 1943. The sun beat down mercilessly on Rendova Island in the Solomon Chain as 23-year-old Private First Class Jefferson Williams wiped sweat from his brow. The Alabama farm boy turned United States Marine had been deployed with the 1st Marine Raider Battalion just 3 days prior, and already the humidity felt worse than the hottest summer back home. What Jefferson couldn't possibly know that morning was that his childhood experience with his father's tractor was about to save not only his life, but the lives of his entire company. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable tale of how one resourceful young man's quick thinking transformed an abandoned vehicle into a defensive marvel that would become the stuff of Pacific theater legend. Jefferson Williams had grown up tending crops in rural Macon County, Alabama, where mechanical aptitude wasn't just useful, it was essential. As the eldest son of sharecroppers, he had learned to repair equipment with whatever materials were at hand. His father, Augustus Williams, had saved for 7 years to purchase a used Farmall tractor, and when it broke down, which it frequently did, there was no money for professional mechanics. Jefferson became the family's resident fix-it expert by age 12, cobbling together solutions from scrap metal and discarded parts. "My daddy always said that a man who can't fix his own equipment ain't got no business having it," Jefferson would later recall in a letter to his younger sister Esther. "I never thought tinkering with that old tractor would prepare me for war, but the good Lord works in mysterious ways." The Williams family had managed to save enough to send Jefferson to Tuskegee Institute for 1 year before the attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. He enlisted in 1942, becoming one of the first African Americans accepted into the Marine Corps after President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802 that prohibited racial discrimination in the defense industry. Basic training at Montford Point, North Carolina, had been its own battle. Segregated from white recruits and subjected to harsher conditions, Jefferson and his fellow black Marines persevered through discrimination that sometimes felt as dangerous as enemy fire. "The drill instructors made sure we knew we weren't wanted," Sergeant Isaac Powell, Jefferson's squad leader, noted in his post-war memoir. But Williams never complained. He just kept his head down and worked twice as hard as everyone else, had a way with machinery that bordered on supernatural, could take apart an engine blindfolded and put it back together better than it was before. Powell, a former schoolteacher from Detroit, recognized Jefferson's potential immediately and made him the unofficial battalion mechanic. Whenever vehicles broke down, Jefferson was called to troubleshoot, earning him the nickname Wizard among both black and white Marines who begrudgingly sought his expertise. By the time the 1st Marine Raider Battalion landed on Rendova, Jefferson had developed a reputation as someone who could salvage equipment others had written off as unsalvageable. This reputation would soon be put to the ultimate test. The Solomon Islands campaign was entering a critical phase by mid-1943. After securing Guadalcanal, American forces were island-hopping toward the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul. Rendova represented a stepping stone and a potential airfield location that would allow American planes to extend their reach across the Southwest Pacific. The Japanese had established a garrison of approximately 700 soldiers on Rendova, and intelligence reports suggested they were well equipped with light artillery and several Type 95 Hago tanks. These were light tanks, easily transported to island locations, but still deadly against infantry with their 37mm main guns. Captain Thomas Richardson, commanding officer of Baker Company, gathered his platoon leaders on the morning of June 18th for a situation assessment. Richardson was a career Marine, a veteran of the Banana Wars in Nicaragua, and not a man given to exaggeration or undue alarm. The intelligence he shared that morning, however, made even the most seasoned officers shift uncomfortably. "Reconnaissance spotted a Japanese reinforcement convoy landing on the North Shore last night," Richardson explained, pointing to a crude map sketched in the dirt. "Estimate 100 to 200 fresh troops with supplies. They'll likely move south to reinforce the main defensive positions before we can establish our perimeter. Lieutenant Gordon Campbell, a lanky Bostonian with wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance at odds with his combat record, studied the map with concern. "That puts them on a direct path to our position, sir. We're still digging in. Perimeter defenses are 50% at best." Richardson nodded grimly. "I'm aware, Lieutenant. Division is sending reinforcements, but they won't arrive until tomorrow at the earliest. We need to slow the enemy advance until then." "With respect, sir," interjected Lieutenant Michael Sullivan, a stocky former football player from Nebraska whose ruddy face was already peeling from sunburn. "Slowing down 200 fresh troops with our current manpower is a tall order. We have 78 effectives, limited ammunition, and no armor support." Powell, who was included in the meeting as the ranking non-commissioned officer, remained silent but noted how Jefferson Williams listened intently from his position at the edge of the gathering. Technically, as a private first class, Jefferson shouldn't have been present at an officer's briefing, but his skills as a mechanic had made him a valuable resource, and Richardson made allowances for valuable resources. "We make do with what we have, gentlemen," Richardson concluded. "Lieutenant Sullivan, I want your platoon to establish an observation post here." He pointed to a ridge overlooking a narrow jungle path. "If the Japanese use this route, I want to know numbers, equipment, and direction of travel. Do not engage unless discovered. This is intelligence gathering, not an ambush." As the officers dispersed to their assignments, Jefferson approached Sergeant Powell with an unusual request. "Sergeant, that disabled Type 95 we found yesterday, is it still in the clearing 200 yards east?" Powell frowned. The tank in question had been abandoned by retreating Japanese forces, apparently due to engine trouble. It had been deemed unsalvageable after a cursory inspection by the battalion maintenance team. "It is, but it's just a hollow shell now. Engines seized up completely. Why?" Jefferson shifted his weight from one foot to the other. A habit Powell had noticed emerged when the young Marine was formulating an idea he wasn't certain would be well received. "I think I might be able to get it running, sir. Not fully operational, but enough to move it, and I had an idea about how we might use it." Powell's expression was skeptical, but he had learned not to dismiss Jefferson's mechanical hunches. "Explain." "That tank is sitting on high ground overlooking the main approach. If we could get it into position and make it look operational, it might give those reinforcements pause. Maybe even force them to take a longer route." "A scarecrow strategy? That's assuming they don't realize it's inoperable." Jefferson's eyes lit up with an intensity that Powell had learned meant the quiet Marine was fully in his element. "What if we could make it more than a scarecrow? What if we could make it look like it's not just operational, but actively defending?" Within 20 minutes, Jefferson was presenting his plan to Captain Richardson, who listened with a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. Resources were limited, time was short, and 200 enemy soldiers were advancing toward an undermanned position. Unconventional solutions were all they had. "You're telling me you can make a dead tank appear to be firing?" Richardson asked, his tone making clear how dubious he found this proposition. "Not exactly firing, sir," Jefferson clarified, "but I can create the illusion of an active tank. Smoke, noise, movement. Enough to make anyone approaching think twice about continuing along that path." Richardson exchanged glances with Lieutenant Sullivan, who shrugged. "We don't have many options, sir. Williams has pulled off mechanical miracles before." "You have 4 hours, Private," Richardson said after a moment of consideration. "Sergeant Powell, assign 3 men to assist. Lieutenant Sullivan, proceed with the observation post as planned. If this works, it gives us a fallback option. If not, we stick with our original defensive strategy." Jefferson selected his team carefully. Private Henry Wilson, who had worked as an auto mechanic in Chicago before the war, Private First Class Robert Thompson, a former steelworker from Pittsburgh with significant welding experience, and Private George Martinez, a slender, quick-witted young man from New Mexico who had a talent for improvisation that rivaled Jefferson's own. The abandoned Type 95 Hago tank sat partially concealed by jungle foliage, its olive-green paint mottled with rust and vine growth. The Japanese flag painted on its side was barely visible beneath a layer of mud and vegetative debris. At just under 8 tons, it was small by tank standards, more like a light armored vehicle than the heavier Sherman tanks the Americans typically deployed. This smaller size, however, made Jefferson's plan more feasible. First, we need to assess what's actually working. Jefferson instructed his team as they approached the vehicle cautiously. Though abandoned, there was always the risk of booby traps. After a thorough inspection that confirmed the tank was indeed free of explosives, the team got to work. The engine was, as reported, completely seized, the result of running without proper oil. The main gun was intact, but immovable due to a damaged traverse mechanism. The interior was cramped, smelling of oil and something unpleasantly organic that suggested the previous crew's hasty departure might not have been entirely voluntary. "The good news is the fuel tank is still quarter full," Jefferson announced after checking the gauges, "and the electrical system might be salvageable." "How is that good news if the engine won't run?" Martinez asked, wiping sweat from his forehead with a bandana. Jefferson smiled. "Because we don't need the engine to run. We just need people to think it's running." Over the next 3 hours, the team worked with focused intensity. Thompson used his welding skills to repair key electrical connections, bypassing damaged components with wire salvaged from their own equipment. Wilson dismantled parts of the engine, not to repair it, but to access the fuel system. Martinez was sent back to their lines to gather specific supplies, signal flares, empty ration tins, communication wire, and as many smoke grenades as he could requisition without raising too many questions. While they worked, Lieutenant Sullivan's observation team radioed with increasingly concerning reports. The Japanese reinforcement column was moving faster than anticipated. Approximately 200 soldiers with light artillery support were less than 2 miles from the American position and moving steadily south along the exact route Richardson had predicted. "They'll be here within 2 hours, Powell informed Jefferson as he came to check on their progress. "Please tell me this contraption of yours will be ready." Jefferson, covered in grease and sweat, emerged from beneath the tank with a determined expression. "It'll be ready, Sergeant. But I need one more thing. A phonograph." Powell stared in disbelief. "A what?" "A phonograph, or any kind of record player. And the louder, the better." "Williams, we're in the middle of a jungle on an island in the South Pacific. Where exactly do you expect me to find a record player?" Jefferson wiped his hands on a rag. "The chaplain has one. Uses it for Sunday services. Has a hand crank so it doesn't need electricity." Powell's expression suggested he was questioning either Jefferson's sanity or his own for even entertaining this conversation. "And what exactly do you plan to do with the chaplain's phonograph in this death trap?" "Sound effects, Sergeant. The most convincing part of any illusion is what you hear." Remarkably, Chaplain Frank Morrison not only possessed the requested phonograph, but enthusiastically offered it for what he called the Lord's mechanical miracle. The device was a portable Victrola with a hand crank and surprising volume for its size. Morrison even contributed his limited record collection, though Jefferson was primarily interested in one particular recording, a symphonic piece with significant percussion. By the time the Japanese column was reported to be less than 1 mile away, Jefferson's burning tank trick was ready for its debut performance. Captain Richardson, Lieutenant Sullivan, and Sergeant Powell gathered for a final briefing on what Jefferson had created. "It's a 3-part illusion, sir," Jefferson explained. "Visual, auditory, and movement. We've rigged the electrical system to the tank's lights, which will flash in a pattern suggesting muzzle flashes from the main gun and machine guns. We've created a controlled fire system using the tank's own fuel that will produce smoke and occasional flames without causing an actual explosion. And we've set up a series of wires that will allow us to create movement from a safe distance." "And the phonograph?" Richardson asked, still clearly dubious about this particular element. "The recording will provide the sound of engine noise and, with proper timing, simulated gunfire. It's amazing how real it sounds when played through that metal chamber." Powell interjected. "The real question, Captain, is whether the Japanese will fall for it. They know their own equipment." "They know their equipment under normal circumstances," Jefferson countered. "But in combat, with limited visibility, taking fire, or what they think is fire, most people don't stop to analyze whether a threat matches exact specifications. They react to the danger. Richardson studied the young Marine's face for a moment, then nodded decisively. Very well. Get your team to the safety position and prepare to initiate on my signal. Lieutenant Sullivan's observers will relay when the Japanese column comes into view of the tank position. As Jefferson led his team to their concealed operation point, a shallow depression approximately 100 yards from the tank, with good sight lines but adequate cover, he couldn't help but wonder if his improvised plan had any real chance of success. Farm machinery was one thing, simulating an operational enemy tank was quite another. The waiting was excruciating. Every insect sound, every rustle of leaves seemed magnified in the tense silence. Martinez nervously checked and rechecked the triggering mechanisms they'd established. Thompson maintained a white knuckle grip on the detonator that would ignite their carefully prepared fuel mixture. Wilson kept his binoculars trained on the approach path, watching for the first sign of the Japanese column. "Movement," Wilson whispered suddenly. 300 yards and closing. Scout element looks like 5 men. Jefferson peered through his own field glasses. The Japanese scouts moved cautiously, rifles at the ready, scanning the jungle on both sides of the path. Behind them, just coming into view, was the main column. A long line of soldiers marching in formation with light artillery pieces being pulled by teams of men rather than vehicles. "They're right on schedule," Martinez murmured. "If they maintain that pace, they'll be in optimal position in about 7 minutes. Jefferson nodded, feeling sweat trickle down his spine that had nothing to do with the tropical heat. "Start the phonograph. Low volume at first. We want them to hear it just as they come around that bend." Martinez began cranking the Victrola. The initial sounds were barely audible, a low rumble that could be mistaken for distant thunder or machinery. As instructed, he gradually increased the volume as the Japanese scouts drew closer to the tank's position. The lead scout stopped suddenly, raising his hand in a signal that froze the entire column. He cocked his head, clearly hearing something unexpected. After a brief consultation with his comrades, he directed 2 men to advance while the others maintained position. "They're investigating," Wilson whispered, "coming right toward the tank." "Hold," Jefferson cautioned as Thompson's finger hovered near the detonator. "Not until more of them are in the target zone." The 2 Japanese scouts moved with practiced stealth, their weapons ready as they approached the area where the tank was concealed. When the first man caught sight of the partially hidden vehicle, he dropped immediately to a prone position, signaling his partner to do the same. After observing for several tense moments with no movement from the tank, the scout began crawling forward for a closer look. "Now?" Thompson asked, his voice strained. Jefferson shook his head. "Not yet. He's reporting back. Wait for it." Sure enough, the scout retreated to his companion, and both men made their way back to the main column. Animated discussion ensued, with officers consulting and gesturing toward the tank's position. "They're debating whether it's operational or abandoned," Jefferson surmised. "That's our cue. Martinez, maximum volume. Thompson, initial ignition sequence. Wilson, flare signal on my mark." As the Japanese officers continued their discussion, the volume of the phonograph suddenly increased dramatically. The recording, a piece by Tchaikovsky with prominent timpani, now sounded remarkably like the rumble and clank of a tank engine coming to life. Simultaneously, Thompson triggered the first phase of their fuel ignition system. Smoke began billowing from the tank's engine compartment and exhaust ports, not the black smoke of a catastrophic fire, but the grey-white smoke of an engine starting after prolonged disuse. The Japanese reaction was immediate. The entire column shifted into defensive positions, with some soldiers taking cover and others bringing weapons to bear on the tank's location. "Flare now," Jefferson ordered, and Wilson launched a signal flare that arced high above the trees before falling directly behind the tank. The timing was perfect. As the flare descended, Thompson triggered the second ignition phase. The fuel mixture they had prepared ignited with a controlled whoosh, sending a gout of flame upward that, from the Japanese perspective, made it appear as if the tank had fired its main gun. The electrical system Jefferson had rigged began functioning, lights flashing in the pattern of machine gun fire from the tank's ports. "Movement sequence," Jefferson directed, and Martinez began manipulating the series of wires they had attached to branches and foliage around the tank. The vegetation moved in a pattern, suggesting the tank was adjusting its position, though the vehicle itself remained stationary. The effect on the Japanese column was dramatic. What had been an orderly advance dissolved into confusion as soldiers sought cover from what appeared to be an operational enemy tank firing directly at them. Japanese officers shouted orders, attempting to organize a response, but the continuing fire from the tank made coordination difficult. "Second flare," Jefferson called, and another signal rocket illuminated the scene. Under this light, the Japanese could see what appeared to be a fully operational Type 95 Heigo tank engaged in a defensive action against their position. The Japanese commander, faced with what seemed to be an established American defensive position, complete with armored support, made a decision that would change the course of the battle for Rendova. Rather than continuing the advance along their planned route, he ordered his forces to withdraw and circle around, a detour that would add miles to their journey and precious hours to the Americans' preparation time. As the Japanese column retreated into the jungle, Captain Richardson's voice crackled over the radio. "Williams, report what's happening." Jefferson couldn't keep the note of triumph from his voice as he responded. "They're withdrawing, sir. The entire column is breaking contact and moving east. They're taking the long way around." There was a moment of silence before Richardson replied, "Maintain your position. I'm sending reinforcements to your location." "Well done, Williams. Well done indeed." The burning tank trick had worked beyond anyone's expectations. What Jefferson couldn't know as he watched the Japanese forces retreat was that this was only the beginning. The respite gained by his ingenious deception would prove crucial in the hours to come, as the Japanese, believing they faced a much larger and better equipped force than actually existed, would make a series of tactical errors that would ultimately cost them not just time but the entire engagement. As darkness fell over Rendova Island that evening, Jefferson Williams sat with his team, sharing rations and the quiet satisfaction of men who have faced overwhelming odds and prevailed through ingenuity rather than firepower. The burning tank continued to smolder convincingly in the distance, maintaining the illusion for any Japanese reconnaissance that might be watching. "You know what this reminds me of?" Jefferson said as he sipped coffee from a tin cup. "Back home, when crows would get into our corn. My father couldn't afford ammunition to shoot them all, so we made scarecrows. But not just any scarecrows. We rigged them with pieces of metal that would clang in the wind and shiny bits that would flash in the sun. Made those crows think twice." Martinez chuckled. "So you're saying the Imperial Japanese Army is no smarter than a flock of crows?" "I'm saying," Jefferson replied thoughtfully, "that fear and uncertainty are powerful weapons. Sometimes the most effective deception isn't trying to hide your presence. It's making your presence seem more dangerous than it actually is." Powell approached their position, hunkering down beside them with a rare smile breaking through his usually stern demeanor. "Captain Richardson wants to see you, Williams, all of you actually. Word from Battalion is that reinforcements will be here by dawn. Your little magic show bought us the time we needed." "Just following orders, Sergeant," Jefferson replied modestly. Powell shook his head. "That was a lot more than following orders, son. That was the kind of thinking that wins wars." As Jefferson rose to report to the captain, he couldn't know that his improvised defense would become a case study in resourcefulness, or that his burning tank trick would eventually be incorporated into Marine Corps training materials. He couldn't foresee that the delay he had created would allow American forces to establish a defensive perimeter that would repel the Japanese counterattack when it finally came, or that Rendova would become a crucial airfield supporting operations throughout the Solomon Islands. What Jefferson Williams did know, as he followed Sergeant Powell through the darkening jungle, was that his father had been right. A man who understands machinery holds power beyond the merely mechanical, and sometimes the most effective weapon in warfare isn't a gun or a bomb. It's the mind that can turn the mundane into the miraculous when circumstances demand nothing less. The night was just beginning, and for Jefferson and his comrades, the most challenging test still lay ahead. The Japanese would return, and when they did, they would come with caution, born of their encounter with the Phantom tank. That caution would make them hesitate at crucial moments, second-guess their intelligence, and ultimately make mistakes that would cost them not just time, but the entire battle. As Jefferson reported to Captain Richardson's command post, the distant glow of the burning tank illuminated the sky behind him, a beacon of American ingenuity in the vast darkness of the Pacific night. The first hour of Jefferson's improvised defense had changed the tactical situation dramatically. The next hour would test whether his deception could be maintained long enough to secure not just temporary advantage, but lasting victory. Captain Richardson's command post was a shallow depression beneath a canopy of camouflage netting, illuminated by a single shielded lantern that cast more shadows than light. Maps were spread across a makeshift table, a salvage door balanced on ammunition crates, and radio operators maintained hushed communications with other Marine positions across the island. The captain himself stood with his back to the entrance, conferring with Lieutenant Sullivan when Jefferson and his team arrived. "Williams," Richardson acknowledged, turning to face them, "I've just received confirmation from our observation posts. The Japanese column has diverted to the eastern approach, adding at least 5 hours to their march. That gives us until dawn to prepare a proper welcome." The captain's weathered face, typically impassive, showed a hint of approval. "Your tank deception exceeded expectations." "Thank you, sir," Jefferson replied, standing at attention despite his exhaustion. "But it's only a temporary solution. Once daylight comes, any close inspection will reveal the trick." Richardson nodded. "I'm aware. That's why we're modifying our defensive strategy to capitalize on the advantage you've given us." He gestured to the map. "The eastern approach forces the Japanese through this narrow valley between these two ridgelines. Perfect terrain for an ambush if we can position enough firepower on these high points." Lieutenant Sullivan adjusted his glasses as he studied the map. "The problem is manpower, sir. Even with the reinforcements arriving at dawn, we'll be stretched thin, covering both the original approach and this new route." A contemplative silence fell over the command post, broken only by the soft crackle of radio static. Jefferson shifted his weight from one foot to another, a habit that Sergeant Powell had come to recognize as a precursor to one of the private's unorthodox suggestions. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Jefferson finally asked. Richardson raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Go ahead, Private. What if we don't need to cover both approaches? What if we could ensure the Japanese continue along the eastern route even after daylight potentially exposes our deception?" The captain's interest was piqued. "I'm listening. The Japanese now believe there's American armor at our original position. If we reinforce that belief, make them think we've established a strong defensive line with multiple tanks, they'll commit to the eastern approach regardless of what daylight reveals about our initial deception." Richardson exchanged glances with Sullivan. "And how exactly do you propose we create the illusion of multiple tanks when we don't have a single operational one?" Jefferson outlined his plan with growing confidence, describing how they could expand their initial deception to suggest a full armored unit rather than a single tank. Using materials already available, empty fuel drums, camouflage netting, and signal equipment, they could create silhouettes and sound effects that, when viewed from a distance, would present a convincing facsimile of an American defensive position with armored support. "It's essentially a theater production, sir," Jefferson concluded. "The audience only needs to believe what they're seeing long enough for us to set the real trap on the eastern approach." After a moment's consideration, Richardson made his decision. "Lieutenant Sullivan, take Williams and his team plus 2 additional squads. You have 4 hours to create this illusion. I want it convincing enough to be visible to any reconnaissance the Japanese might send at first light." "And if they attack the position, sir?" Sullivan asked. "Minimal defensive presence, observation and communication only. At the first sign of a major assault, those men withdraw to our main position in the Eastern Valley. Our objective isn't to win a direct engagement. It's to channel the enemy exactly where we want them." As they left the command post, Sullivan pulled Jefferson aside. "This is twice now you've proposed solutions that go well beyond your rank and training, Williams. Where does a farm boy learn to think like this?" Jefferson's response was measured, his voice quiet but firm. "With respect, sir, when you grow up without resources, you learn to solve problems with what you have, not what you wish you had. On the farm, if something broke and you couldn't fix it, crops died and people went hungry. There was no calling for reinforcements or waiting for better equipment. Sullivan studied the young Marine with newfound appreciation. "Well, farm boy, let's see if your agricultural ingenuity can fool the Imperial Japanese Army a second time." The next 4 hours passed in a blur of focused activity. Jefferson's expanded deception plan required coordinated efforts from multiple teams, each responsible for a different element of the illusion. Private Thompson led a group creating tank silhouettes from timber frames covered with canvas and mud to approximate the texture of armored vehicles when viewed from a distance. Martinez organized the placement of fuel drums packed with damp vegetation that, when ignited, would produce the thick smoke characteristic of vehicles operating in jungle conditions. Wilson established a network of tripwires and noisemakers that would create the impression of mechanical movement and activity throughout the position. Jefferson himself focused on the centerpiece of the deception, transforming their original burning tank into what would appear to be an American command vehicle, directing the operations of this phantom armored unit. Using parts salvaged from damaged radio equipment, he created an antenna array that, when illuminated by carefully placed signal lights, would suggest communication capabilities far beyond what Baker Company actually possessed. As they worked, the island's dense jungle amplified the sounds of their preparation, creating an acoustic backdrop that actually enhanced their deception. The clanking of tools against metal, the rumble of fuel drums being positioned, and the calls between working parties all contributed to the impression of a significant American force establishing a formidable defensive position. "Sometimes what you hear is more convincing than what you see," Jefferson explained to a skeptical corporal, who questioned whether their hasty constructions would withstand daylight scrutiny. "The Japanese will hear us working through the night. They'll hear what sounds like mechanical activity and construction. Their imagination will fill in the details better than anything we could physically build." By 3:30 in the morning, the expanded deception was in place. From a distance, the original position now appeared to house not just one tank, but what might be interpreted as a platoon of armored vehicles supported by entrenched infantry. Strategic placement of signal lights created silhouettes against the jungle backdrop, while periodic flares illuminated glimpses of activity that suggested a much larger force than actually existed. Lieutenant Sullivan surveyed their work with growing appreciation. "If I didn't know better, I'd think we had a company of Sherman tanks hidden in there." "That's the idea, sir," Jefferson replied. "By dawn, we need just enough observation personnel here to maintain the illusion, while the rest of our forces move to the ambush positions on the eastern approach." Sullivan nodded, checking his watch. "Speaking of which, we should head back to the command post. Captain Richardson will be finalizing the ambush plan, and I want you there for that discussion." Jefferson looked surprised. "Me, sir. I'm just a private." The lieutenant clapped him on the shoulder. "A private who's twice outthought an enemy force. I'd say that earns you a seat at the planning table." Dawn was approaching when they returned to the command post. The first hints of grey light filtered through the jungle canopy, and birds had begun their morning chorus, providing natural cover for the sounds of Marine reinforcements arriving at the rendezvous point 2 miles behind their position. Captain Richardson had received updated intelligence during the night. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were expected shortly after daybreak, followed by the ground force that had been diverted by Jefferson's initial deception. The timing would be tight. They needed to maintain the illusion long enough for aerial observation to confirm the apparent American armored presence, then transition their main force to the ambush position before the Japanese ground troops arrived. "Our reinforcements include a platoon of Army Rangers and support weapons," Richardson explained to his gathered officers and non-commissioned officers. "Combined with our existing forces, that gives us enough firepower to establish a 3-point ambush along the eastern valley. Lieutenant Campbell will command the northern position, Lieutenant Sullivan the southern, and I'll coordinate from the central position with our heavy machine guns." The officers nodded their understanding, but Sergeant Powell raised a practical concern. "The Japanese column included light artillery, sir. Even with our elevated positions, we'll be vulnerable if they deploy those guns effectively." This was the crucial question, and all eyes turned to the captain for his response. Richardson smiled thinly. "That's where Williams' deception continues to pay dividends. Intelligence believes the Japanese commander is convinced he's facing a much larger force with armored support. Rather than advancing cautiously with artillery preparation, we expect him to attempt a rapid assault through the valley to outflank what he perceives as our main defensive line. Jefferson considered this analysis. With respect, sir, that assumption depends on the Japanese continuing to believe our deception after daylight, if they send ground reconnaissance rather than relying solely on aerial observation. A valid concern, Richardson acknowledged, which is why we're maintaining a small force at the original position with a specific task, visible activity. They'll conduct what will appear from a distance to be normal defensive preparations, but they'll be prepared to withdraw at the first sign of a major Japanese approach. The briefing continued with detailed assignments for each unit. Jefferson and his original team would join Lieutenant Sullivan's position on the southern ridge, where their familiarity with the Japanese movements and equipment might prove valuable in anticipating enemy reactions. As the meeting concluded, Richardson held Jefferson back for a private word. "Your innovations have given us a fighting chance, Williams. But I want to be clear about something. If this works, when this works, I expect you to accept proper recognition for your contribution." Jefferson looked uncomfortable. "That's not necessary, sir." "It's not about what's necessary, it's about what's right," the captain replied firmly. "The Corps hasn't always treated men like you fairly, but I'll be damned if I let that continue under my command. You've earned recognition, and I'll see that you receive it." Before Jefferson could respond, a radio operator called urgently for the captain's attention. "Sir, observation post reports Japanese reconnaissance plane approaching from the north." "Showtime," Richardson said grimly. "Everyone to positions. Williams, make sure your deception team is ready for their close-up." The Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, a Mitsubishi Ki-46 Dyna, made 3 passes over the American positions as the morning light strengthened. From the aircraft's perspective, the scene below would have appeared to confirm the worst fears of the Japanese commander. A substantial American force with armored support had established a blocking position directly in the path of their original advance. The carefully orchestrated movement, strategically placed smoke emissions, and occasional signal flashes all contributed to the impression of a force much larger than the skeleton crew actually manning the position. Jefferson, now established with Sullivan's team on the southern ridge overlooking the Eastern Valley approach, tracked the aircraft through binoculars. "They're taking photographs," he observed. "That works in our favor. By the time those images are developed and analyzed, the engagement will be over." Sullivan nodded in agreement, "And their ground commander will make decisions based on what his aerial reconnaissance reported, not what might be revealed by closer inspection." Within the hour, their prediction was confirmed. Japanese scouts appeared at the western end of the valley, moving with the cautious professionalism that characterized the Imperial forces. Behind them came the main column, now reorganized after their nighttime diversion. From his elevated position, Jefferson could see approximately 200 troops advancing in combat formation, with light artillery pieces and heavy machine guns distributed throughout their ranks. "They're committed to the valley approach," Sullivan observed with satisfaction. "Your deception worked perfectly, Williams. They're avoiding what they believe is our main defensive line with armor support." The valley itself was a natural ambush location, a half-mile stretch of relatively open ground, flanked by steep, jungle-covered ridges. The Japanese column would be exposed to fire from elevated positions on both sides, with limited cover and no easy exit once fully committed to the passage. It was, in military terms, a killing zone, though that particular phrase was carefully avoided in all official communications in deference to the sensitivities of censors and posterior documentation. Captain Richardson's plan called for allowing the Japanese force to advance halfway through the valley before initiating contact. This would catch the enemy in maximum exposure, with their options for retreat or maneuver severely limited. The Marines and Army Rangers were well camouflaged in their elevated positions, weapon sights trained on pre-designated segments of the valley floor below. Jefferson found himself positioned with a clear view of the Japanese command element, officers recognizable by their bearing and the deference shown to them by the troops. He nudged Private Martinez, who had been assigned as his spotter. "Focus on the officers when it starts. That's where the decision-making happens." Martinez adjusted his binoculars. "The one in the center, The one checking maps with his subordinates. He's the commander. Jefferson nodded. And he's concerned. Look at his gestures, the way he keeps looking back toward our deception position. He's worried about being caught between two American forces. The Japanese column continued its advance, moving with increasing caution as they progressed deeper into the valley. When the lead elements reached the midpoint marker, a distinctive lightning-struck tree that Richardson had designated as their trigger point, signal mirrors flashed briefly from the Central American position. "Stand by," Sullivan murmured, raising his hand in the preparatory signal. When Richardson's whistle cut through the morning air, Sullivan's arm dropped sharply. "Commence firing." The coordinated American fire struck the Japanese column with devastating precision. Heavy machine guns from the central position swept the valley floor, while rifle fire from the flanking positions targeted officers and weapon teams. The effect was immediate and chaotic, the disciplined Japanese formation fragmenting as soldiers sought cover that simply didn't exist in the exposed valley. Jefferson, firing his M1 rifle methodically from his elevated position, observed the Japanese commander attempting to rally his forces for a counterattack up the northern ridge. "Lieutenant, they're trying to assault Captain Richardson's position." Sullivan had already noted the movement and was adjusting his unit's fire accordingly. "Shift targets. Concentrate on the assault group moving north." The next 15 minutes unfolded with the terrible efficiency of a well-executed ambush. The Japanese forces, caught in the open and under fire from 3 directions, fought with characteristic determination but were unable to establish effective offensive action. Their light artillery, which might have provided some countermeasure, was neutralized in the opening moments of the engagement when targeted by American sharpshooters, specifically assigned to eliminate crew-served weapons. The Japanese commander, recognizing the untenable nature of his position, attempted to organize a fighting withdrawal back toward the western entrance of the valley. This maneuver might have succeeded had it not been for the final element of Richardson's plan, a blocking force of Army Rangers who had circled behind the Japanese entry point while the main engagement was underway. Caught between the Marine positions on the ridgelines and the Ranger blocking force, the Japanese troops found themselves in a tactical situation with no favorable options. The Imperial commander, demonstrating the courage that even their adversaries respected, personally led a desperate charge against the southern ridge where Jefferson and Sullivan's team were positioned. "Prepare for close engagement," Sullivan shouted as the Japanese force surged up the steep incline toward their position. Marines shifted to defensive firing positions, some fixing bayonets as the distance closed. Jefferson found himself directly in the path of the Japanese advance, his rifle reporting steadily as he acquired and engaged targets with the measured precision that had become his hallmark. When his ammunition was expended, he transitioned seamlessly to his sidearm, continuing to deliver accurate fire even as the distance diminished. The Japanese charge, valiant as it was, ultimately failed to breach the American position. Caught on the exposed slope with minimal cover, the attacking force suffered unsustainable casualties before reaching the Marine defensive line. The Imperial commander, identified by his uniform and sword, fell just 20 yards from Jefferson's position, struck multiple times but continuing to urge his men forward until he could no longer stand. By 0900 hours, just 1 hour after the engagement began, the battle was effectively over. Isolated pockets of Japanese resistance remained, but the coordinated enemy force had been neutralized. Of the approximately 200 Japanese troops that entered the valley, more than half had been rendered combat ineffective, with the remainder surrounded and cut off from support or escape. Captain Richardson, surveying the valley from his central position, keyed his radio to deliver a succinct situation report to battalion headquarters. Phase line Baker secured, enemy force contained. Requesting medical evacuation for casualties and prisoner processing team for approximately 70 detainees. The American casualties, while not negligible, were remarkably light given the scale of the engagement, 8 killed and 22 wounded, most not seriously. The successful ambush enabled by Jefferson's deception strategy had achieved the kind of decisive victory that military planners dream of but rarely experience. Maximum effect with minimum friendly casualties. As Marine corpsmen attended to the wounded and security teams processed prisoners, Captain Richardson called his officers and key non-commissioned personnel together for an immediate after-action review. Military operations rarely allow for immediate reflection, but Richardson was the kind of commander who believed in capturing lessons while they were fresh. Gentlemen, I want your initial assessments. What worked, what didn't, and what can we learn from this engagement? The captain's expression was grim but satisfied, the face of a man who has accomplished his mission but takes no pleasure in the human cost it entailed. Lieutenant Campbell spoke first. The deception was the key element, sir. Without Williams' tank trick and the expanded illusion, the Japanese would have approached along their original route, where we lacked adequate defensive positions. Sullivan nodded in agreement. The psychological aspect can't be overstated. Once convinced they faced a superior force with armor, the Japanese commander made decisions based on that false information, decisions that channeled his troops exactly where we wanted them. Sergeant Powell, ever the pragmatist, offered a more qualified assessment. The deception worked because we had adequate time to prepare the ambush. If the Japanese had moved more quickly or sent more thorough ground reconnaissance, the outcome might have been different. Richardson turned to Jefferson, who had remained characteristically quiet during the discussion. Williams, you're the architect of the strategy that made this possible. Your thoughts? Jefferson considered his response carefully. The deception succeeded because it played into existing Japanese expectations and fears, sir. They were already concerned about American armor in the region. We just provided visual confirmation of what they were already predisposed to believe. An important psychological insight, Richardson noted approvingly. People are more likely to accept evidence that confirms their existing beliefs than to question information that aligns with their expectations. As the discussion continued, a runner approached with a message for the captain. Richardson read it quickly, his expression shifting to one of surprise and then satisfaction. Gentlemen, Battalion Headquarters has informed me that our action here this morning has broader strategic implications than we realized. The Japanese force we engaged was actually the advance element of a much larger reinforcement group. By eliminating this forward unit, we've disrupted their entire operational timeline for this sector. The officers exchanged glances, absorbing the significance of this information. What they had perceived as a relatively limited engagement, significant for their immediate tactical situation, but modest in the broader context of the Pacific campaign, was now revealed to have operational-level importance. Furthermore, Richardson continued, Division Intelligence believes the Japanese commander we neutralized was Colonel Takeo Yasuda, a highly regarded tactical officer whose loss will impact enemy operations throughout the Solomon Islands theater. This revelation added another dimension to their achievement. In modern warfare, the elimination of key leadership often yields more strategic value than territorial gains or material losses inflicted on the enemy. As the meeting concluded, Richardson pulled Jefferson aside once more. I've recommended you for the Silver Star, Williams. Your innovative thinking and courage under fire exemplify the highest traditions of the Marine Corps. Jefferson appeared momentarily speechless. Sir, I was just doing my job. Your job was to follow orders as a private first class in a rifle company, Richardson replied firmly. What you did went far beyond that. You demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking that changes battles and saves lives. He paused, then added with deliberate emphasis, Every Marine in this company is going home to his family because of what you accomplished today. The significance of that statement wasn't lost on Jefferson. In a war where casualty rates in offensive operations often reached 25% or higher, their nearly intact company was a statistical anomaly, one directly attributable to the strategy he had devised. In the days that followed, as American forces consolidated their position on Rendova and began constructing the airfield that would support operations throughout the Solomon Islands chain, the story of the burning tank trick spread through the Marine units. Initially shared as an amusing anecdote about Yankee ingenuity, it evolved into a tactical parable that would eventually find its way into military training curricula. Jefferson Williams received his Silver Star in a ceremony attended by the entire battalion. The citation, read by the regimental commander, detailed how his exceptional resourcefulness and tactical innovation had enabled a decisive victory while minimizing American casualties. What the citation couldn't capture, however, was how this recognition represented not just acknowledgement of a single action, but a small yet significant crack in the edifice of discrimination that had defined Jefferson's military experience. When a correspondent from Stars and Stripes sought to interview him for a feature article, Jefferson initially declined, uncomfortable with the attention. It was Sergeant Powell who convinced him to reconsider. "This isn't just about you, Williams," the seasoned non-commissioned officer explained. "There are thousands of colored troops serving throughout the Pacific and in Europe, doing their duty with little recognition. Your story gives them something to point to, evidence that contribution and courage can be recognized regardless of color." Jefferson eventually agreed to the interview, though he insisted that it include mention of Thompson, Martinez, and Wilson, whose contributions had been essential to the success of the deception. The resulting article, published under the headline, "Alabama Farm Boys' Ingenuity Outfoxes Japanese Force," was notable not just for its content, but for its remarkable absence of the qualifiers that typically accompanied any mention of black servicemen in military publications of the era. The journalist, a former English professor named Stanley Kowalski, seemed particularly fascinated by the improvisational aspects of Jefferson's solution. "What strikes me about your approach," he remarked during their conversation, "is how it resembles theater more than conventional military tactics. You essentially staged a production with the Japanese as your audience." Jefferson had never considered it in those terms, but he recognized the accuracy of the observation. "I suppose there is something theatrical about it. We created an illusion that told a specific story, one the Japanese were already inclined to believe." "That's the essence of effective theater," Kowalski noted. "The best productions don't force a narrative on the audience. They tap into something the audience already carries within them." This perspective offered Jefferson a new framework for understanding what he had accomplished, not just a military deception, but a form of psychological theater in which understanding the audience had been as important as the technical details of the performance itself. As the campaign for Rendova concluded, and the Marines prepared for their next objective in the island-hopping strategy, Jefferson received unexpected news. He was being reassigned to a specialist role in the 3rd Amphibious Corps, where his mechanical aptitude and demonstrated tactical innovation would be applied to developing countermeasures against Japanese armor and fortifications. The new assignment represented both recognition of his capabilities and a practical application of his unique skills. It also meant separation from the company that had become his surrogate family. The men who had come to respect him not for his color, but for his contributions. On his last evening with Baker Company, Jefferson found himself sharing coffee with Sergeant Powell near the newly constructed airfield. The sergeant, never one for sentimentality, seemed uncharacteristically reflective as they watched aircraft landing and taking off, tangible evidence of the strategic foothold they had helped secure. "You know, Williams, when you first came up with that tank trick, I thought it was the craziest idea I'd ever heard," Powell admitted. "A broken-down Japanese tank fooling its own people? Sounded like something from a Sunday funny paper." Jefferson smiled. "I wasn't entirely convinced it would work either, to be honest. But that's what makes it brilliant," Powell continued. "The best ideas often sound crazy at first, because they're approaching the problem from an angle nobody's considered. That's a gift, son, one that's got nothing to do with where you're from or what you look like." As their conversation wound down, Powell handed Jefferson a small package wrapped in oilcloth. "The men wanted you to have this, something to remember Baker Company by." Inside was a meticulously crafted model of a Type 95 Hago tank, approximately 6 inches long, made from salvaged metal and painted with remarkable attention to detail. On its base, a small brass plate bore a simple inscription: "The Wizard's First Trick, Baker Company, 1st Marine Raider Battalion, Rendova, 1943. Jefferson ran his fingers over the model, momentarily unable to speak. This tangible acknowledgement of his contribution and acceptance meant more than any official recognition or medal. "I don't know what to say, Sergeant." "You don't need to say anything," Powell replied gruffly. "Just keep using that farm boy ingenuity of yours to bring more Marines home alive." 2 days later, As Jefferson boarded the transport that would take him to his new assignment, he carried with him not just the physical model, but a profound realization. The true measure of his service was not found in medals or citations, but in the lives his innovation had preserved. Americans who would return home to their families because a sharecropper's son from Alabama had learned to see opportunity where others saw only obstacles. Jefferson Williams would go on to develop numerous tactical innovations throughout the remainder of the Pacific Campaign, earning additional commendations and eventually a battlefield commission to second lieutenant. His burning tank trick would be studied by military tacticians and incorporated into deception doctrine that would influence operations for decades to come. After the war, Jefferson returned to Tuskegee Institute on the GI Bill, completing the education that had been interrupted by his military service. He earned a degree in mechanical engineering and went on to a distinguished career with General Motors, where his practical experience and innovative approach to problem-solving proved as valuable in industrial application as they had in combat. When interviewed for an oral history project in 1978, Jefferson was asked what he considered the most important lesson from his wartime experience. His response revealed both wisdom and characteristic humility. "I learned that resourcefulness is often more valuable than resources," he reflected. "When you don't have what you need, you learn to accomplish your objective with what you have. And sometimes, that limitation forces you to discover solutions that would never emerge if you had everything you thought you needed." The interviewer then asked about the racial barriers Jefferson had faced both during and after his military service, clearly expecting an account of bitterness or resentment. Jefferson's response surprised him. Of course there were barriers, some obvious, others hidden, but focusing on obstacles doesn't remove them. It just consumes the energy you could be using to find a way around, over, or through them. That's true whether the obstacle is racial prejudice or a Japanese roadblock. You acknowledge the reality, then you get to work on the solution. That philosophy, pragmatic, resilient, and fundamentally optimistic, characterized not just Jefferson Williams' approach to warfare, but his entire life. The burning tank trick that had stopped 200 Japanese soldiers in a single hour on a remote Pacific island wasn't just a clever tactical innovation. It was an expression of a mindset that refused to be limited by circumstances, expectations, or artificial barriers. In military academies and staff colleges, the Rendova deception is still studied as an example of asymmetric advantage, how resourcefulness and psychological insight can overcome numerical or material disadvantage. But perhaps its greater lesson lies in what it reveals about human potential when freed from artificial constraints and judged solely on the merit of contribution. Jefferson Williams passed away in 1992 at the age of 72, surrounded by family in the Detroit home he had purchased with his General Motors pension. Among his personal effects was a small, carefully maintained model of a Japanese tank, a reminder of a moment when a farm boy's ingenuity changed the course of a battle, saved the lives of his comrades, and demonstrated that the measure of a man is found not in his circumstances, but in what he creates from them. His story remains a testament to the often overlooked contributions of African-American servicemen during World War II, the transformative power of innovation, and the enduring truth that the most effective weapon in any conflict is the human mind's capacity to reimagine what is possible. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.